Methodical Realism by Etienne Gilson, Chapter 1. This is a book by a neo-scholastic philosopher, mainly attacking other neo-scholastic philosophers. Neo-scholasticism, or Neo-Thomism, is a 19th and 20th century movement to recover and develop the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. It was given a significant boost by the 1879 papal encyclical Aeterni Patri, and it produced many teaching manuals that were widely used in Catholic philosophy and theology before Vatican II in the early 1960s. In the 20th century, Neo-Thomism is often contrasted with modernism, which is defined in various ways. Gilson belongs to a branch of Neo-Thomism that I call existential Thomism. This school of Thomism argues that Thomas's thought contains the resources needed to answer questions that have been raised in a new and more powerful way by the post-Nietzschean existentialist movement of the early 20th century. A good short resource on 20th century Thomism is Romanes Cesario's Short History of Thomism. Critical idealism is Gilson's main target in this book. Some neo-scholastics share modern philosophers' preoccupation with epistemology as a foundation for philosophy. Since neo-scholastics are often accused of being naive realists, some neo-scholastics respond by trying to show that neo-scholastic realism can answer the problems raised by critical philosophy. Gilson claims this is a mistake. He says that critical idealism holds that philosophy begins in thought and then goes from thought to being. This also is the method of mathematics, which can be seen especially in the work of Descartes. Cartesian principles include that it is valid to infer from knowing to being, and that whatever can be affirmed of the idea of a being can be affirmed of that being. These are key doctrines of Descartes, and these lie at the center of the promised Copernican revolution in philosophy, which places the knowing mind, the cogito, and its epistemology at the center of the philosophical task. Descartes holds that our only knowledge of beings comes from our clear and distinct ideas of those beings. This is the rationalist's method, which can also be seen in Spinoza. Kant reduces the scope of metaphysics to the necessary conditions for Newtonian physics, which makes speculative metaphysics effectively impossible, because it is not able to supply the sensory intuition that Kant seeks. Kant and Descartes alike affirm that knowing is a precondition for being, and this for Gilson is part of the definition of modern idealism. Philosophers, he says, have lost the habit of thinking from the perspective of the object. Instead, we begin in the cogito, the knowing subject. The object is an aspiration for us, rather than a starting point. Starting with the cogito requires us to show how thought is not imprisoned within itself. Now, some neo-scholastics think that they can prove realism by reaching the object from idealist starting points, but again, Gilson insists this is a mistake. One of the problems faced by this kind of epistemology is called the problem of the bridge. This employs a spatial metaphor. If we think of the object on one side and the mind on the other, the problem of the bridge is the problem of connecting them. How can that gap between the mind and the object be bridged? The problem with this, Gilson says, is the limit of the metaphor. If we begin by thinking of mind and object as distinct and separated, then one of them can never be in the other in the way that classical epistemology requires. Beginning as an idealist, says Gilson, always means ending as an idealist. It is not possible to escape one's idealist starting point and arrive at knowledge of the real world. The root problem, says Gilson, is that Descartes set the starting point for knowledge in the intuition of thought. He notes that St. Augustine had the basic insight behind Descartes' cogito, and that one can build a metaphysics from it, but not a realist metaphysics. If I can grasp being only through my thoughts, how can I ever grasp being outside of my thoughts? That is plainly impossible. Gilson argues that whoever begins with Descartes must end either with Berkeley or with Kant. The Cartesian experiment was an admirable failure, Gilson says. It was even genius, but it was a failure, and we would be foolish to begin it again expecting different results. Neo-scholastic critical realists reject the bridge method, and some of them are driven to immediate realism, which Gilson finds to be logically sound, but not actually realist. Now, realism is a neo-scholastic category, not a scholastic category. St. Thomas, St. Bonaventure, and others were realists, but without knowing it. The medieval nominalism versus realism disputes were not concerned with realism in our 20th and 21st century sense. The medievals were either unaware of this problem or denied that there was any problem at all. Gilson plans to show in this book that immediate realism does not avoid the problems connected with mediate realism. Realism is the doctrine that being is independent of our actual knowledge of it. So Gilson asks, is immediate realism even a coherent doctrine by this definition? Can thought give us anything other than thought? Can it give us thought-independent existence? And Gilson says, no, this is a mistake. It is impossible to arrive at thought-independent existence if you begin with thought. By contrast, Noel claims that yes, this can be done. We just have to find a point where mind and the thing known are unified. Gilson replies that even if we were able to find such a point, that point would be a point in thought, not a point in being. We see here a parallel to the failure of the cogito. The cogito proves the existence only of myself. Its existence cannot be generalized to all things. And so Gilson says on page 19, if one's starting point is a percipi, the only esse one will ever reach is that of the percipi. We never arrive at being itself of the object, we only arrive at the being of the appearance of the object. Critical realism is another alternative, which Gilson criticizes as being self-contradictory and representing an impossible ambition. For scholasticism, the existence of mind-independent objects must be a premise and not a conclusion. Now, idealism defines reality in terms of thought and faces the problem of reconnecting thought to objects. Critical realism, as a reaction to idealism, tries to accomplish this task. Gilson criticizes it for the illusion that one can extract an ontology from an epistemology. We cannot begin with knowledge and arrive at being. Gilson insists we cannot arrive at things if we start in thought. And since we need things for our philosophy to work, this means that we ought not to start in thought. Naive realism is another alternative. If we reject mediate realism and immediate realism, must we embrace naive realism? Gilson's answer is no. Now, in mediate realism, we know real things through our ideas of them. And in immediate realism, we know real things directly with the mind. Naive realism is a system of what you see is what you get, holding that we discover the real unproblematically. Now, this is obviously wrong and collapses upon even the most elementary philosophical reflection, and hence we call it naive. Gilson's neo-scholastic epistemology, his realism, is not naive because it recognizes the problems that idealism poses. He offers, he says, a conscious realism, the fruit of reflection and considered choice. He does reject the idealist framing of the issue of epistemology, which he says presupposes an idealist answer. This neo-scholastic realism is based upon an idea of what philosophy is, of the philosophical method, and hence he calls it methodical realism. Gilson calls for a return to the philosophic attitude of Thomas and the pre-moderns. He sees philosophy as the love of wisdom, the science of first principles, a systematic working out of conclusions. And he sees it as superior to idealism, which can be seen in idealism's inability to form a coherent and working system. Gilson in this chapter also offers a partial critique of idealism. He says Cartesian philosophy identifies the philosophical method with the method of a particular science. By doing this, it empties philosophy of any content of its own, and the result will be either true and scientific or untrue and unscientific. Now, when Kant shifts from mathematics to physics as a model for philosophy, he renders metaphysics impossible. Descartes, Kant, and Comte each are followed by other thinkers who embrace their criticism, their destructive agenda, but reject their positive constructions. And here we have the formula for the gradual, or in some cases steep, decline of philosophy in the modern period. The destructive or critical project of each generation succeeds, but its affirmative or building project fails and is rejected by succeeding philosophers. Idealism, says Gilson, is philosophical suicide because its internal contradictions ultimately lead to skepticism. We have reality then fragmented into imaginary entities which are endlessly set against one another, and no philosophical genius can reunite them. Gilson says we first must reject the claimed priority of epistemology. We must recognize that epistemology always grows in and with ontology, that is, with a theory of being, with a fundamental metaphysics.